The morning they buried Thomas Norris, the wind came down off the Bighorn foothills carrying the smell of gun smoke that had not yet fully left the air, and his daughter Olive Norris stood at the graveside with her jaw set so hard that the women of Cedar Ridge whispered she had not shed a single tear. They did not understand that Olive had already done her crying in the barn, alone, with her forehead pressed against the flank of her father's mare, in the hour before dawn when there was no one left to see her weakness. By the time the sun came up over the Wyoming Territory grasslands, she had folded her grief into something harder, something that would not bend, because she had learned in 26 years of frontier living that a woman who let herself break in front of others rarely got the chance to put herself back together on her own terms. The town marshal, Amos Keller, stood a respectful 10 feet back from the family plot with his hat in his hands, watching her more than he was watching the preacher. He had ridden out to the Norris ranch 3 days earlier, called by a neighbor who had heard shots, and found Thomas Norris face down in the dirt of his own north pasture, a rifle he never got to fire lying beside him. Amos had seen enough dead men in his years, first in the war and then in the years after, to know a killing that had been made to look like an accident from a real accident, and this had not been an accident. 2 riders had come and gone from the Norris spread that morning, and the tracks they left pointed toward the Coyle Cattle Company land like an arrow drawn in the dust. Jasper Coyle had been trying to buy the Norris ranch for 8 months. The Union Pacific Spur Line Survey had marked the valley as the easiest grade through the foothills, and whoever held that land when the railroad men came through stood to make more money than most folks in the territory would see in 10 lifetimes. Thomas Norris had refused every offer, the last one delivered with a thinly veiled threat that Amos himself had witnessed from across the street outside the Mercantile, Coyle's foreman leaning close to Norris and saying something that made the older man go pale before he shook his head and walked away. Now Thomas Norris was in the ground, and his only child stood over the grave with nothing left in the world but 200 acres of grassland, a mortgage at the territorial bank, and a secret she had not yet told anyone but the marshal. She had seen the men who did it. She had been coming back from the Larson place, riding the ridge trail that overlooked the north pasture, when she heard the shots and reined in her horse behind a stand of cottonwoods, just in time to see 2 riders wheel their horses away from her father's fallen body. She had not been close enough to be seen. She was almost certain of that, but she had been close enough to recognize the paint horse that belonged to Coyle's man, Dutch Halloran, and close enough to see the second rider's black hat with the silver band that every soul in Cedar Ridge knew belonged to Jasper Coyle's segundo, a lean and quiet man named Silas Prout. She had told Amos Keller the night after the shooting, in the low light of her kitchen, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee she never drank, and he had told her, gently but firmly, that this was not information to be shared with anyone else in town until he could gather more than the word of a grieving woman against the most powerful cattleman in 3 counties. "You keep this close, Olive," he had said, using her given name because he had known her since she was a girl of 16 new to the territory with her father, back when Amos himself had only just pinned on the badge. "You keep it close, and you let me work it the way the law is supposed to work. Coyle has money enough to buy every lawyer between here and Cheyenne, and if word gets out that you saw what you saw before I have proof enough to hang it on him, there won't be a rock in this territory safe enough for you to hide under." She had promised him she would keep quiet. And she had kept that promise for 3 long weeks, through the funeral and through the slow, grinding work of grief, through nights alone in a ranch house too big and too silent, through mornings when she woke reaching for a voice that would never answer her again. She kept the promise even as she watched Jasper Coyle's men ride past her fence line with a boldness that felt like a taunt, even as she watched the town grow quieter around her, the way towns did when everyone knew something ugly was happening, and no one wanted to be the one to say it aloud first. It was Amos Keller who broke the silence, 3 weeks after the burial, riding out to the Norris ranch on a gray October evening with news that changed everything. Olive was in the yard, splitting kindling with more force than the task required, when she heard his horse coming up the lane. She recognized the gait of the big bay gelding before she recognized the rider, and something in her chest loosened just slightly at the sound of it, though she would not have admitted that even to herself. Amos Keller was 34 years old, built long and lean the way men got who had spent their youth on horseback rather than behind a desk, with sun-weathered skin at the corners of his eyes from years of squinting into Wyoming light. He had come west after the war ended, one of a great many men who found they could not fit themselves back into the shape of the life they had left behind, and he had found in the Marshal's badge a way to keep doing the only thing he knew how to do well, which was stand between decent people and the men who preyed on them. He had never married. There had been a woman once, back in Ohio, before the war took 4 years of his life and gave them back to him changed. But that story belonged to a version of himself that no longer existed, and he rarely thought of it now except in the deep hours of sleepless nights. He swung down from the saddle and Olive set aside her axe, wiping her palms on her apron, searching his face for whatever news had brought him out at this hour. "I have a witness," Amos said without preamble, because he had learned that Olive Norris did not care for men who danced around hard truths. A drifter named Cole Ashby was working for Coyle through the summer, mucking stalls and mending fence. He got into a dispute over wages 2 weeks back, and Coyle's men ran him off the property with nothing but the clothes on his back. He came to me tonight, half-starved and half-drunk on courage he'd bought with the last of his money, and he told me he heard Dutch Halloran bragging in the bunkhouse about the Norris job, about how Coyle paid him and proved $200 apiece to make an old man's death look like he'd caught his own rifle wrong. Olive felt the ground tilt beneath her for a moment, though she had known since the moment she saw that paint horse wheel away from her father's body. Knowing and hearing confirmed were different animals entirely. "Will he testify?" she asked, and her voice came out steadier than she felt. "He says he will. But a drifter's word against a cattle baron's money is a thin rope to hang a man with, Olive. I need more. I need you to tell what you saw in front of a judge on the record. Ashby's testimony plus yours together, that might be enough to see Coyle stand trial for what he ordered done to your father." She had known this moment would come eventually, had turned it over in her mind on countless sleepless nights, and yet standing in her own yard with the Marshal's steady gray eyes fixed on her, she felt the full weight of what he was asking settle onto her shoulders like a yoke. "If I testify, they will come for me," she said. It was not a question. "Yes," Amos said, because he had never once lied to her and did not intend to start now. "They likely will. Coyle cannot afford to let this go to trial with 2 witnesses standing against him. I would take you somewhere safe, out of the territory if need be, until the circuit judge comes through Cedar Ridge in 3 weeks' time for the fall session. And if I refuse to testify, if I simply disappear the way you are suggesting and let the whole matter lie." Amos was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke there was something raw in his voice that she had not heard from him before. "Then Jasper Coyle keeps this valley, and your father's murder goes into the ground along with him, and nobody in this territory ever answers for it. And you spend the rest of your life knowing you let that happen because you were afraid." Olive Norris looked past him, out toward the north pasture where her father had died, where the grass was already growing back over the place, indifferent to what had happened there, the way the land always was. She thought of her father's hands, rough and patient, teaching her to shoot a rifle when she was 12 years old, because he said a woman alone on the frontier needed to know how to protect herself. She thought of the years he had spent building this ranch from nothing, and the years he would never have now because 2 men had been paid $200 apiece to steal them from him. "I will testify," she said. "I am not going to hide from this, Marshal Keller. I have spent 3 weeks being afraid in this house, afraid of every rider on the road, afraid of every shadow past sundown, and I am tired of it. Fear has already cost me my father. I will not let it cost me my voice as well." Something shifted in Amos Keller's face when she said that, something that looked almost like admiration, though he tried to keep it hidden beneath the professional mask of a lawman with a job to do. "Then we do this carefully," he said. "And you do exactly as I tell you when I tell you, because I intend to see you standing in that courtroom in 3 weeks, not in another grave beside your father's." Olive Norris found herself, in the weeks that followed, spending far more time in the company of Marshal Amos Keller than she had anticipated, and far more time than was entirely proper by the standards of Cedar Ridge's more particular citizens. He moved her, 2 days after that conversation in the yard, from the isolated ranch house to a small room above the mercantile in town, closer to the jail, closer to eyes that could watch for trouble. He came by twice a day to check on her, sometimes with news of the investigation, sometimes, she began to notice, with no news at all, simply with the excuse of checking on her welfare stretched thin enough that she could see through it. She did not mind. That was the thing that surprised her most, in the quiet hours when she allowed herself to examine her own feelings honestly. She had expected to resent the confinement, the constant presence of a guard, even one as gentle as Amos Keller. But instead she found herself watching for him from the window above the mercantile, found herself dressing with slightly more care on the mornings she expected his visit, found herself laughing, actually laughing, for the first time since her father's death, at some dry observation Amos made about the mercantile owner's habit of thumbing the scale when he weighed out flour. "You've got a wicked sense of humor under all that Marshal's solemnity, Amos Keller," she told him one evening in late October, as they sat together at the small table in her room over coffee she had brewed on the little stove, the lamp between them throwing warm light across the worn wooden surface. "A man learns to find the humor where he can," Amos said, "or the job eats him alive. I have seen good men come west and turn hard and mean because they let all the ugliness in and never let anything else back out. I decided a long while back I wasn't going to be one of them." "Is that why you never married?" The question came out before she had quite decided to ask it, and she felt her face warm even as she held his gaze, refusing to look away as though the question had been an accident. Amos was quiet for a moment, turning his coffee cup slowly on the table. "There was a girl back in Ohio before the war. Her name was Margaret. We were engaged to be married when I went off to fight, and by the time I came home 4 years later, I was not the same man who had left, and she had the good sense to see it before I did. She married a banker instead, a steady man who never had to watch what I watched or do what I did. I do not fault her for it. War changes a man in ways that are not always visible until someone who loved the man before has to look at what came home instead. And since then, I have not found a woman who made me want to try again," Amos said, and then, more quietly, his eyes finding hers across the small table, "until recently." The words hung in the lamplit air between them, and Olive felt her heart beating hard against her ribs, felt the sudden nearness of him, the warmth of the small room, the late hour that had crept up on them without either one marking its passage. "Amos," she said softly, and it was the first time she had used his given name without the marshal attached to it, "I have buried a father and I am about to walk into a courtroom that might see me buried alongside him if Jasper Coyle has his way. This is not a fair time to be asking a woman such questions." "No," he agreed, "it is not. So I will not ask them properly, not yet. But I will tell you this much, Olive Norris. When this is finished, when Coyle stands trial and you are safe and this territory has its justice, I intend to ask you again, and I intend to ask it right, with your safety no longer hanging over either one of our heads. Until then, I will simply say that watching over you these past weeks has been the finest part of a hard year, and I do not intend to let it end simply because the danger does." She reached across the table then and took his hand, rough and calloused from years of rope and rein and rifle, and held it for a long moment without speaking, because some things did not need words to be understood between two people who had already begun, without quite meaning to fall in love. The fall circuit court session was 3 weeks away when Amos first heard the news that changed the shape of everything, delivered by a boy of perhaps 14 who came running into the marshal's office breathless from a hard ride, sent by his father who ranched 20 miles east near the county line. "Marshal Keller," the boy gasped. "My pa sent me. He says there's men gathering out at the old Sutter place, 6 or 7 of them, and he recognized 2 as Coyle riders. He says they've got rifles, and they've been asking around about the road to the county seat, about which trail the circuit judge usually rides in on." Amos felt the cold certainty settle into his stomach that he had known would come eventually, the confirmation that Jasper Coyle did not intend to let the matter of Thomas Norris's murder reach a courtroom at all if he could help it. If Coyle's men could not silence the witnesses beforehand, they intended, it seemed, to prevent the trial from happening in the first place, by ambushing the circuit judge himself somewhere along the lonely stretch of road between Cedar Ridge and the county seat at Fort Bridger. He rode straight to the mercantile and up the back stairs to Olive's room, finding her at the window with her sewing in her lap, though her hands had gone still, watching the street below the way she always did now, a habit born of 3 weeks of careful fear. "Judge Halbrook is due to arrive in 6 days, Amos told her, laying out the boy's report. "Coyle means to stop him from ever reaching Cedar Ridge. If the judge is killed or turned back, there is no trial. No trial means no justice for your father, and it means Coyle keeps this valley and everything in it, including, eventually, whatever is left of you and this town once he decides you are still a threat worth removing." Olive set aside her sewing, her face pale but composed. "Then we have to warn the judge. We have to get riders on that road before Coyle's men can spring their trap." "That is precisely what I intend to do," Amos said. "I have already sent word to the deputy marshal in Fort Bridger asking for men to ride escort, but that message will take 2 days to arrive and 2 more for help to reach us, and Coyle's men are gathering now. I mean to ride out myself tomorrow with what men I can gather here in Cedar Ridge, intercept the judge's party before they reach the Sutter Place stretch of road, and bring them in by the North Trail instead, the long way around through Willow Creek, where there is no good cover for an ambush." "I am coming with you," Olive said immediately. "You are not." Amos's voice carried the flat certainty of a man who had already decided this and did not intend to be argued out of it. "You are the reason this whole business started, Olive. If Coyle's men see you riding out into open country, you become the easiest target in the territory, and I will not have your safety on my conscience along with everyone else's. Amos, I have sat in that room above the mercantile for 3 weeks doing nothing but wait and watch out windows while other people decide what happens to my life. I understand why you have kept me there, and I have not fought you on it because I know you have been trying to protect me. But I am done being protected into uselessness. I know this country. I have ridden it since I was 16 years old. I know the trails better than half the men you could gather in this town on a day's notice, and I have a right to ride out and see that my father's killer answers for what he did. Your right does not matter one bit to a bullet, Olive." Amos's voice had risen slightly, and she could see the fear underneath his anger now, could see that this was not about doubting her ability but about the plain terror of what he might lose. "I have buried enough people I could not save. I will not add you to that number, because you decided bravery mattered more than staying alive." "I won't let fear choose for me," Olive said, and the words came out of her with a quiet, fierce clarity that seemed to still the very air of the small room. "Not my own fear, and not yours, Amos Keller, much as I have come to care for you these past weeks. My father is dead because a man with money thought he could simply remove anyone standing between him and what he wanted, and if I hide in this room while other people ride out to face the danger my testimony created, then Coyle has already won something, even if he loses the trial. He will have taught me that fear is the thing that decides what a woman does with her life. I refuse to let him teach me that lesson." Amos looked at her for a long moment, and she watched the argument war behind his eyes, watched him searching for the words that might change her mind, and watched him fail to find them, because some part of him, she suspected, understood exactly what she meant, understood it in his bones from 4 years of a war where fear had tried daily to make his choices for him, and he had refused to let it. "If you ride with us," he said finally, "you ride under my direct order, and when I tell you to fall back, you fall back. No arguments, no hesitation. This is not a matter for pride, Olive. It is a matter for staying alive long enough to see that trial happen." "Agreed," she said, and meant it, though neither of them yet knew how quickly that promise would be tested. They rode out from Cedar Ridge before dawn the next morning, a party of 6. Amos Keller at the head, his deputy, a steady young man named Wyatt Sloan, 3 ranchers who had volunteered when Amos explained what was at stake, men who had known Thomas Norris and did not care for the idea of Jasper Coyle buying his way past the law, and Olive Norris herself, riding her father's mare, a rifle across her saddle that her father had taught her to use when she was 12 years old. The morning was cold and clear, the kind of high plains autumn morning where the sky went on forever in every direction, and the grass lay silver with frost that would not burn off until nearly midday. They rode east along the county road, planning to meet the judge's party at the halfway point near Antelope Springs and turn them north onto the Willow Creek Trail before they ever came within rifle range of the Sutter place, where Coyle's men were said to be waiting. It was Olive, riding a little apart from the group with her sharper eyes trained on the terrain out of old habit, who first noticed the wrongness of the empty road ahead of them near Antelope Springs. "Amos," she called out, reining in her mare, "the judge's party should have left Fort Bridger yesterday afternoon. They should be well along this road by now, especially if they're pushing to reach Cedar Ridge before the weather turns. Why is there no dust ahead of us? No sign of riders at all?" Amos pulled up beside her, scanning the empty road that stretched toward the horizon, the springs themselves visible now as a dark smudge of cottonwoods perhaps 2 miles distant. Something in the stillness of the morning had gone wrong in a way he could not immediately name, and the hair on the back of his neck rose with old instinct. "Wyatt," he called to his deputy, "ride ahead careful and see what you can find at the springs. The rest of us will hold here." But before Wyatt Sloan could spur his horse forward, a rider came into view from the direction of Fort Bridger, pushing his horse hard, and as he drew closer they could see it was one of the men who had been assigned to ride escort with Judge Halbrook's party. "Marshal," the rider called out while still 50 yards distant, his voice cracking with exhaustion and fear. "They hit us at first light. 6 or 7 men came out of the rocks above the springs before we knew they were there. Judge Halbrook is alive. We got him and his clerk into the rocks and they're pinned down, but 2 of our men are wounded and we're low on ammunition. I broke away to find help." Amos felt the plan he had built collapse in an instant, replaced by the raw, immediate reality of an ambush already sprung, not on the road ahead where he had expected it, but at the very springs he had intended to guide the judge's party away from. Coyle's men had moved faster and smarter than he had anticipated, anticipating that Amos himself might try to redirect the judge's route, and positioning themselves at the one crossing point on this stretch of country where any northward diversion would have to pass regardless. "How many men holding the judge?" Amos demanded. "3 able-bodied, counting me before I rode out. Judge Halbrook has a pistol, but he's no gunfighter, and his clerk is worse than useless in a fight." Amos turned to his small party, his mind working fast through the terrain he knew from years of riding this country. The springs sat in a shallow bowl surrounded by low rocky rises, cottonwoods clustered along the water itself, and the only clear approach was the road they were currently on, which meant any direct charge toward the springs would ride them straight into whatever position Coyle's men had taken in the rocks above. "There's a dry wash that runs behind the rise on the north side," Olive said suddenly, and every head turned toward her. "I've hunted that country with my father." It curls around behind the springs and comes up on the north rocks from the blind side. A rider could get in close enough to flank whoever's shooting down at the judge's party without being seen from the road. Amos studied her for a long moment, torn between the tactical value of what she was telling him and the fear that was already climbing up his throat at what he suspected she intended to do with that knowledge. "Draw me the ground," he said, and she did quickly, with a stick in the frosted dirt of the road, showing him the wash, the rise, the blind approach that would let a small party come up on Coyle's men from behind while the main group held their attention from the road. "I will take Wyatt and 2 of the men up the wash," Amos said. "The rest of you hold position here on the road, out of rifle range, and make noise. Draw their eyes toward you. Buy us the time to get into position." "I am coming with you up the wash," Olive said immediately. "I know that ground better than any man here except my father, and he is not here to guide you through it. You will lose time you cannot afford trying to find the path yourself, Amos, and time is the one thing those men pinned down at the springs do not have. Olive, I told you, when I say fall back. This is not falling back. This is going forward where I am the most useful person present, and you know it." Her voice was steady, urgent, and there was no time left to argue the point further with a judge's life and the lives of his escort hanging in the balance. Amos made the decision the way he had learned to make decisions under fire, fast and final, because hesitation cost more than an imperfect choice. "Stay behind me at all times," he said. "The instant I tell you to hold position, you hold, no matter what is happening around you. Do you understand?" "I understand." They left the 2 ranchers on the road with instructions to make noise and draw attention without exposing themselves to direct fire, and Amos led Olive, Wyatt Sloan, and the 3rd rancher, a broad, quiet man named Garrett Voss, off the road and along the line she had sketched, down into the dry wash that cut behind the low rise above Antelope Springs. The wash was narrow enough in places that they had to ride single file, the frost-silvered grass giving way to bare rock and sand as they descended below the level of the surrounding country, hidden from any watcher above. Olive rode second in line behind Amos, her heart hammering, every sense sharpened to a fine, painful point, listening for the crack of rifle fire that would tell her whether Judge Halbrook's party still held out. They heard it soon enough, distant and sporadic, the sound of men exchanging fire in short, careful bursts, ammunition being conserved on both sides. Amos held up a fist, the signal to halt, as the wash curved close beneath the northern rise, and he dismounted, gesturing for the others to do the same and leave the horses tied to a scrub cedar growing improbably out of the rock. "From here we go on foot," he said quietly. "Wyatt, Garrett, you come with me up the north face. Olive, you hold here with the horses. Amos, you hold here," he said again, and this time his voice carried an edge that brooked no argument, the voice of a man who had led soldiers into fire and understood precisely when a plan needed absolute obedience to succeed. "I need to know these horses are secure, and I need to know exactly where to find you when this is finished. That is not protecting you out of foolishness, Olive, that is tactics, and I need you to trust me on this the way I trusted your knowledge of the wash." She held his gaze for a long moment, and something in his face, the plain, naked fear beneath the marshal's composure, the fear not of the fight ahead but of losing her, made her nod. "I will hold here," she said. "Be careful, Amos." "Always am," he said, with a ghost of the dry humor that had first made her laugh weeks earlier, and then he was gone, moving up the rocky slope with Wyatt and Garrett behind him, rifles held ready, 3 shapes disappearing into the tumbled boulders above the wash. Olive stood with the horses in the cold morning air, listening to her own heartbeat, listening to the distant gunfire that seemed to pause and then resume, unable to tell from the sound alone whether the pause meant good news or terrible news. The minutes stretched unbearably long. She checked her rifle for the 3rd time, though she knew it was loaded and ready, simply for something to do with her shaking hands. It was the sound of hooves, not gunfire, that made her freeze, the unmistakable rhythm of a horse approaching along the wash from the direction they had come, from the road where the two ranchers had been left to create a distraction. Her first thought was that something had gone wrong there, that one of the men had been sent to warn them of some new danger, and she stepped forward to meet the rider, rifle held ready but not yet raised. The rider who came around the bend of the wash was not one of the ranchers. It was Silas Prout, Jasper Coyle's segundo, the man with the black hat and silver band that Olive had seen wheeling away from her father's body 6 weeks earlier, and beside him rode Dutch Halloran on his paint horse, the same paint horse she had recognized from that terrible morning. They had circled around, she realized with a cold plunge of understanding, anticipating exactly the kind of flanking maneuver Amos had attempted, or perhaps simply patrolling the ground behind their own position out of the same instinct for caution that had made Amos suspicious of the empty road. There was no time to run. Prout's rifle was already coming up, and Olive did the only thing her body knew how to do after 12 years of her father's careful instruction. She raised her own rifle and fired, not carefully aimed, not calm, but fast, and the shot went wide of Prout but close enough to make his horse shy sideways, spoiling his own aim as he fired back, the bullet cracking off the rock beside her head close enough that she felt the sting of stone fragments against her cheek. She threw herself sideways behind the boulder where the horses were tied, working the lever of her rifle with hands that shook but did not fail her, and fired again, this time aiming for Dutch Halloran as he tried to bring his own weapon to bear, and though her shot did not find him, it forced him to duck low over his horse's neck, buying her a precious few seconds. Amos! She screamed, as loud as her lungs would allow, knowing the sound would carry up the rocky slope and knowing also that it would tell Prout and Halloran exactly who they had found hiding in the wash. Amos! They're here! Above on the north rise, Amos Keller heard her voice cut through the crack of rifle fire like a blade through fog, and every other consideration in his mind, the ambush he was fighting to break, Coyle's men still firing from their position above the springs, all of it fell away beneath the singular terror of that scream. He turned from the fight without a second thought, sliding and scrambling back down the rocky slope with Wyatt Sloane's voice calling after him that they had the men above pinned, and did not need him to abandon the position. But Amos was already moving, because some things a man simply could not weigh against each other, and Olive's life was not a thing he was prepared to gamble against tactical advantage. He came around the boulder into the wash to find Olive pressed against the rock, rifle raised, blood on her cheek from stone fragments, facing down 2 mounted men who had clearly recognized the disadvantage of firing at a barricaded position from horseback and had pulled back to circle for a better angle. Amos did not hesitate. He raised his own rifle and fired at Silas Prout, and though his shot also went wide in the tight confines of the wash, it was enough to make both riders understand that the balance of the fight had shifted, that they were no longer facing one frightened woman but a marshal with a rifle and, moments later, Garrett Voss coming down the slope behind him with his own weapon raised. Dutch Halloran wheeled his paint horse and spurred hard back down the wash the way he and Prout had come, and after a moment's hesitation, clearly weighing the odds and finding them wanting, Silas Prout followed him, disappearing around the bend in a spray of frost-dampened gravel, leaving the wash suddenly, almost eerily quiet except for the ragged sound of Olive's breathing and the distant, now sporadic gunfire from the springs above. Amos crossed the distance between them in 3 long strides and pulled her into his arms so fiercely that the rifle nearly fell from her hands, and she let it fall, let herself be held, feeling the tremor running through his body that matched her own. "I told you to hold here," he said into her hair, his voice rough with a fear only now finding its release. "I told you to hold here and you nearly got yourself killed." "I did hold here," she said, half laughing and half sobbing against his chest. "I held here and fought them off, Amos. I did not run, and I did not let them pass." He pulled back just far enough to look at her face, at the small cut on her cheek where the stone had struck her, and something in his expression shifted from fear into something that looked almost like wonder. "You are the single most stubborn, most fearless woman I have ever known in my life, Olive Norris, and I believe I have loved you since the night you told me you would testify no matter the cost." "Then perhaps you ought to finish what you started saying that night in my room over the mercantile," she said, "because this seems like exactly the sort of moment when a woman deserves a proper declaration, gunfire notwithstanding." Above them on the rise, the gunfire had fallen entirely silent, and a moment later Wyatt Sloane's voice called down that Coyle's remaining men were surrendering, that Judge Halbrook and his party were safe, wounded but alive, and that it was over. But Amos Keller did not immediately answer his deputy's call, because he was too busy pressing his lips to Olive Norris's, right there in the cold, dry wash with blood on her cheek and gun smoke still hanging in the air, kissing her the way a man kisses a woman he has come very close to losing, and has decided, in that instant, he will never risk losing again if he can help it. They rode back to the road together perhaps 20 minutes later, having first secured the wounded and confirmed that Judge Halbrook, though shaken and grazed along one arm by a bullet, was well enough to travel, and that his clerk, though thoroughly terrified, was unharmed. Two of Coyle's men, caught in the pincer between the road party's distraction and Amos's flanking assault, had surrendered outright once they saw the fight was lost, and they proved, once disarmed and questioned, remarkably willing to talk in exchange for leniency, confirming everything Cole Ashby had told Amos weeks earlier about the murder of Thomas Norris, and adding a great deal more besides about Jasper Coyle's plans for the ambush of the judge. Silas Prout and Dutch Halloran, however, were nowhere to be found, having fled the scene entirely rather than risk capture, and Amos knew that meant they would run straight back to warn Coyle that his plan had failed, and that two of his men were now prepared to testify against him. "We ride for Cedar Ridge tonight," Amos said to Judge Halbrook once the wounded had been tended as well as could be managed on the trail. "Coyle will know by morning that his ambush failed, and a man who has already tried murder and attempted the killing of a circuit judge is not a man who will simply accept defeat quietly. We need to have you safely in town, under guard, and we need to move quickly." They rode through the remainder of that day and into the evening, a somber and exhausted party, reaching Cedar Ridge well after dark to find the town lit and waiting, word having somehow already traveled ahead of them, as word always did in small territorial towns, that there had been a fight at Antelope Springs and that the marshal's party had prevailed. Olive was helped down from her horse by townspeople she had known her whole life, women pressing blankets and hot coffee into her hands, men clapping Amos on the shoulder and asking after the judge. And through all of it, she found herself searching the crowd for Amos's face, finding him always already looking back at her, as though neither of them could quite convince themselves the other was truly safe, until they had confirmed it with their own eyes yet again. Jasper Coyle did not go quietly in the end, though he came closer to it than Amos had expected. Word reached Cedar Ridge 2 days later that Coyle had attempted to flee the territory entirely, having received warning from Prout and Halloran of the failed ambush. But the deputy marshal from Fort Bridger, riding hard with a small posse in response to Amos's earlier message, intercepted Coyle's wagon on the road south before he had traveled more than 30 miles, along with a strongbox containing enough cash to fund a very comfortable disappearance in California or points further west. The trial, when it finally convened 2 weeks later than originally scheduled, on account of Judge Halbrook's wounded arm requiring time to heal enough for him to sit through the long proceedings, was the largest gathering Cedar Ridge had seen in years. People came from ranches 30 miles distant to fill the small courtroom and spill out onto the street beyond, drawn by the drama of a cattle baron finally facing justice for the kind of casual, moneyed violence that most frontier folk had learned to simply endure as the cost of living within reach of powerful men. Olive Norris took the stand on the second day of the trial, and though her hands trembled slightly as she raised them to swear her oath, her voice did not waver once she began to speak. She told the courtroom what she had seen that morning on the ridge trail above the north pasture, the paint horse and the black hat with the silver band, the two riders wheeling away from her father's body. She told them of Coyle's earlier threats, witnessed by half the town outside the mercantile. And when Coyle's lawyer, a sharp city man brought up from Cheyenne, attempted to suggest that a grieving daughter's memory of a distant and traumatic scene could hardly be trusted as reliable testimony, Olive looked him steadily in the eye and said, "I have ridden this country since I was 16 years old, sir. I know every horse and every man in 3 counties by sight, the way you know the streets of whatever city raised you. I did not imagine what I saw. I have simply been waiting 6 weeks for someone to be willing to hear it." Combined with the testimony of Cole Ashby and the 2 captured henchmen who had turned state's evidence in exchange for reduced sentences, combined with the testimony of Judge Halbrook himself regarding the ambush at Antelope Springs, the case against Jasper Coyle proved overwhelming. The jury, 12 men drawn from Cedar Ridge and the surrounding ranches, deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning a verdict of guilty on charges of murder for the death of Thomas Norris, and separate charges related to the attempted killing of a circuit judge and his escort. Coyle was sentenced to hang, a sentence that would be carried out the following spring after the necessary territorial appeals process ran its course, though few in Cedar Ridge doubted the outcome would change. Silas Prout and Dutch Halloran, captured eventually in a boarding house in Cheyenne where they had foolishly lingered rather than fleeing further, would stand trial separately and face similarly grim prospects. When the verdict was read, Olive Norris sat in the front row of the courtroom with tears finally, openly running down her face, 6 weeks of grief and fear and fierce determination finding release all at once, and it was Amos Keller who sat beside her, his hand wrapped around hers, who wiped those tears away with his thumb and said quietly, for her ears alone, "Your father would be proud of you, Olive. I do not believe I have ever seen anyone braver." The Cedar Ridge that emerged in the weeks following the trial felt different to Olive, lighter somehow, as though the whole town had been holding its breath for months without quite realizing it, and had finally been allowed to exhale. The Coyle Cattle Company's holdings, seized as part of the legal proceedings pending resolution of debts and claims, were parceled out over the following year to smaller ranchers and homesteaders, including, eventually, a modest additional 200 acres granted to Olive Norris herself in recognition of the wrong done to her family, land that adjoined her father's original spread and would, in time, allow her to expand the herd her father had spent 20 years building. But it was not the land, nor the justice finally served, that occupied Olive's thoughts most fully in those weeks. It was Amos Keller, who came to call on her now not as a marshal protecting a witness, but simply as a man courting a woman, bringing wildflowers gathered along the creek bottom in early November when most blooms had already gone to seed, sitting with her on the porch of the ranch house in the fading autumn light, and talking not of danger and testimony, but of small things, of books she loved, of his mother back in Ohio who wrote him letters twice a year, of the dreams he had once had of running cattle himself someday, rather than chasing outlaws. "I have never asked you," Olive said one such evening, wrapped in a shawl against the cooling air while Amos sat beside her on the porch step, "whether you intend to remain marshal forever, or whether that dream of running cattle is one you might still pursue." "I have given it a good deal of thought lately," Amos admitted. "A man cannot chase down outlaws forever, Olive. My knees ache in the cold mornings worse than they did 5 years ago, and I have started to think there might be a finer way to spend the years I have left than riding hard after other men's troubles. I have some money saved. Not a fortune, but enough to make a start if I found the right land and the right reason to settle it. "And have you found the right reason?" she asked, though she already suspected the answer, watching his face in the lamplight spilling from the window behind them. "I believe I have," Amos said, and then in a motion that was not entirely smooth, being a man far more practiced with a rifle than with matters of the heart, he shifted to kneel before her on the porch step, taking her hand in both of his. "Olive Norris, I told you back in that room above the mercantile that when this business with Coyle was finished, I intended to ask you a question properly, with your safety no longer hanging over either one of our heads. That time has come, and I do not intend to waste it. I love you. I have loved you, I believe, since the very first evening I sat across a small table from you and watched you decide, in the space of a single conversation, that you would rather face danger honestly than live safely behind a lie. I want to build a life with you, on this land your father loved, raising cattle and children and growing old watching the same Wyoming sunsets we are watching now. Will you marry me?" Olive Norris did not hesitate, though her voice caught with emotion as she answered. "Yes, Amos Keller. Yes, 1,000 times yes. I have known for weeks now that I loved you, since that morning in the wash when you came running down that slope for me rather than staying to finish the fight, because some part of you understood, even then, that I mattered to you more than tactics or duty or anything else in this world. I would be honored to build that life with you." They were married the following spring, in April of 1880, in a ceremony held on the porch of the Norris ranch house, with nearly the entire town of Cedar Ridge in attendance. The same porch where Amos had proposed, decorated now with the first wildflowers of the season, woven into garlands by the women of the town who had, over the past months, come to regard Olive Norris with something close to reverence for the courage she had shown. Cole Ashby, the drifter whose testimony had helped seal Coyle's fate, stood among the guests, having been given steady work on the Norris ranch as thanks for his willingness to speak the truth when it would have been far safer to stay silent. Wyatt Sloan, promoted to full marshal of Cedar Ridge upon Amos's resignation from the position, served as best man, and the whole town seemed to understand that this wedding represented something larger than the joining of two people, a kind of collective healing after months of fear and violence, a proof that the frontier could still produce justice and love in equal measure if enough people refused to let fear make their choices for them. Amos Keller sold his small holdings, and combined with Olive's inheritance and the additional land granted to her, they built together over the following years a ranch that grew to be one of the finest in that stretch of Wyoming territory, running cattle across the same north pasture where Thomas Norris had died, a pasture that Olive insisted on keeping and working rather than avoiding, because she said her father would have wanted his land to keep living rather than becoming a monument to grief. Their first child, a son they named Thomas after Olive's father, was born in the winter of 1881, delivered in the same ranch house bedroom where Olive herself had been raised, with Amos pacing the hallway outside in an agony of nervousness that made the midwife laugh and remark that she had seen fewer nervous men facing down outlaws than Amos Keller facing down the prospect of fatherhood. 2 years later came a daughter, Sarah, named for Amos's mother back in Ohio, who traveled west by train, a journey that would have been unthinkable a decade earlier, to meet her grandchildren and see with her own eyes the life her son had built. A third child followed in 1885, another son, whom they named Wyatt after the deputy who had stood beside Amos through the fight at Antelope Springs and who remained, years later, one of the family's closest friends, having himself married a schoolteacher who came west to Cedar Ridge and settled into the growing town. The territory itself changed around them as the years passed, Wyoming achieving statehood in 1890, the railroad finally coming through not along the route that had once made Thomas Norris's land so valuable and so dangerous to hold, but along a different survey further south, a fact that Olive sometimes reflected on with a strange mixture of relief and bitter irony. Thinking of all that had been risked and lost for a valley the railroad ultimately did not need after all. But the ranch prospered regardless, built not on the speculation of railroad money, but on the steady, patient work of cattle and grass and seasons turning one into another. Work that Amos and Olive did together, side by side, in a partnership that deepened rather than faded with the passing years. Jasper Coyle hanged in the spring following his trial, as sentenced, and though Olive felt no particular satisfaction in the news when it reached Cedar Ridge, she felt, for the first time since her father's death, a genuine and complete sense of peace. The knowledge that the account had been settled, that her father's death had been answered by the law rather than left to fester as an unpunished wrong, and that she had played her own part in seeing that justice done rather than hiding from it out of fear. On quiet evenings in the years that followed, when the children were grown enough to be trusted asleep in their beds, and the ranch house had settled into its nighttime stillness, Olive and Amos would sometimes sit together on that same porch where he had proposed, watching the same stars wheel slowly overhead that had watched over Wyoming territory since long before either of them had been born. And Amos would sometimes ask her, in the manner of a man who still could not quite believe his own good fortune, whether she had ever regretted riding out that morning to Antelope Springs, whether the fear she had refused to let choose for her had ever, in quieter moments, made her wonder if a different choice might have spared her the terror of that morning in the dry wash. And Olive would always answer him the same way, taking his weathered hand in hers, the hand of a man who had once been a soldier and then a lawman, and was now simply a rancher and a husband and a father, the finest thing he had ever become in his own estimation. And she would say, "I have never once regretted it, Amos. That morning taught me something I have carried with me every day since, something I hope our children learn from us as they grow. Fear will always be there, asking to be allowed to make our choices for us. But a life lived by fear's choosing is not truly a life at all. I would rather have ridden into that ambush 100 times over than spend even one day letting fear decide who I was going to be." Amos would lean over then in the gathering dark and kiss her softly, the way he had kissed her first in that cold, dry wash with gun smoke still hanging in the air. And he would tell her, as he told her often through all the years of their marriage, that she remained the bravest and most extraordinary woman he had ever known, and that loving her had taught him more about courage than 4 years of war ever had. Their children grew up hearing the story of that autumn in 1879, told and retold at family gatherings until it took on the polished quality of legend, though every detail in it remained true. The murder of a grandfather they had never known, the marshal who fell in love with the witness he was sworn to protect, the ambush at Antelope Springs, and the woman who rode into danger rather than let fear choose her path for her. Young Thomas Keller, when he grew old enough to understand the full weight of the story, would sometimes ask his mother whether she had truly not been afraid that morning in the wash, facing down 2 armed men with nothing but her father's rifle and her own steady hands, and Olive would tell him the truth, the same truth she told all her children in turn as they grew old enough to ask. "I was more afraid than I have ever been in my life, before or since," she would say. "Fear does not disappear simply because you refuse to let it choose for you, Thomas. It stays right there with you, every step of the way. The difference is simply this: you decide what you do despite it, rather than because of it. Your father taught me that courage was never truly the absence of fear at all, but the choice to act rightly in spite of it. That is the only kind of courage worth having, and it is the kind I hope you carry with you all the days of your life." The Norris Keller Ranch, as it came to be known throughout the county, stood for decades as one of the finest spreads in that part of Wyoming, its cattle prized at market, its land tended with the same careful patience Thomas Norris had first brought to it as a young homesteader decades earlier. Amos Keller lived to see his grandchildren born, lived to see the century turn and the frontier he had known as a young marshal transform into something closer to settled civilization, with schools and churches and a railroad depot in Cedar Ridge itself. though he never lost the quiet watchfulness of a lawman, a habit of scanning any room he entered for the exits, a habit Olive found endearing rather than troubling. A reminder of the man he had been when she first came to depend on his steady presence. And Olive Norris Keller, who had once stood in a kitchen with her hands wrapped around a cup of untouched coffee and promised a marshal she would keep silent about what she had seen, who had later stood in that same marshal's path and told him she would not let fear choose for her, lived out her long life on the land her father had loved and died for, surrounded by children and grandchildren, by a husband who never once stopped looking at her the way he had looked at her that morning in the dry wash, with equal parts terror and wonder at what a brave heart could accomplish when it refused to be governed by anything less than love and conviction together. She died an old woman, many years later, in the same ranch house bedroom where she had been born and where her own children had been born in turn, with Amos beside her holding her hand just as he had held it on the courthouse steps the day Jasper Coyle was sentenced. And her last words, according to the family who gathered around her in those final hours, were a quiet echo of the ones that had defined the most important morning of her life. "No fear," she murmured, smiling faintly at something only she could see. "No fear at all now, only love. It was always love in the end, wasn't it, Amos? It was always love that chose for me." And Amos Keller, who had loved her since a lamplit evening over untouched coffee more than 4 decades earlier, pressed his lips to her hand and told her, one final time, that she had been the bravest and finest thing that had ever happened to him, and that he would love her still, in whatever country lay beyond this one, for as long as love itself endured.